I'm Laurence. Today I'll be giving a talk on DevOps is dead long with DevOps. And I think some of you watching this now will be like, what is he talking about? So let me go into that. So bit of introduction about myself. I'm currently a manager of software development at PayPal. I run the DevOps team as well as the latency optimization team within PayPal. So we deal mainly with like the DevOps side of things as well as performance management on our PayPal APIs. In my past life, I used to run the DevOps team and the digital infrastructure team at Singapore Power. And that job was interesting because I think the DevOps scope there was really big. It went all the way from data center all the way up to the VM level, or even like running a platform for people to build their apps on, right? That's something similar to Kubernetes, but back then we were using PCF. So that's the introduction bit. So yeah, I think the first question we need to answer right now in this talk, right, is, what is DevOps? What really is DevOps? And I think the key reason why I'm asking this question is because when we go out to a lot of conferences, right, you see all the different vendors lined up in the conference and they're all saying that, oh, you have to buy my software to do DevOps, right? Or you have to pay for this special additional subscription to be DevOps certified, or some nonsense like that. And thankfully, this conference doesn't have a lot of these sponsors, but yeah. So, given all the noise out there, what exactly is DevOps? And is DevOps just running Kubernetes? Because I have seen vendors who are out there just saying, oh, if you don't have Kubernetes, you're not doing DevOps, right? But is that really it, right? Does Kubernetes really make you DevOps ready? Is it just a collection of tools like, Jenkins or all the different vendor software that I shall not name. And a lot of times they sell you that, oh, you need to buy my software to be DevOps really. And then is it just about automation? And I've seen cases where people automate all the way to, even when things have not much business value, they go ahead and automate it, and then management starts saying, oh, DevOps is a waste of money. We're putting too much resources into DevOps, and it's not worth doing. So the question here is, right, what exactly is DevOps, right? Is it just about having a pipeline? And my answer to that is no as well. And the way I look at this is, I think DevOps is an art form. And I've said this to some people and every time it gets people laughing, but I feel that DevOps is an art form of being lazy, right? We are engineers, right? And I think DevOps is fundamentally here to help us do our job in a simpler way without spending as much effort. And I think the why of DevOps is something that we should appreciate better before we start going into, what should we be doing in DevOps. So to me, right, for a successful DevOps team to exist, I think there are three main principles that I would like to talk about. I think the three principles here are having a repeatable processes, having rapid feedback loop, and having extreme ownership on the various pieces in the ecosystem that the engineers are looking after. And I'll go into this into detail. So repeatable, right? So I think there are a couple of good CI/CD pipelines out there. I think Benny earlier has talked about what his team uses as well. And I think one of the key things about having CI/CD, right, is that your entire process is automated. So, you don't have to worry about getting someone up to speed about the processes it takes to getting something pushed live, or the processes it takes to getting something done, right? Because it's all documented in the configuration. Now you can actually go one step further and make it even better by having it in code. And the links here, I'll share my slides with the organizers later. But in the links here, you can actually write the pipelines in code itself, right? So you basically have all this pipeline as code, your configuration as code, documentation as code, and when people leave the company, you actually still retain a lot of this data in your Git repositories as code. So knowledge is not lost along the way, and it makes things repeatable. You can understand why things happen a certain way. So yeah, to make things repeatable, these are the kind of tools that you will have to be looking at. And rapid feedback loop, right? So I think this is something that most people in DevOps, they don't talk about, because they talk about all the fancy stuff. They don't really talk about having the rapid feedback loop. And I think one of the key principles here is that when you have the rapid feedback loop, it makes debugging easier. It makes it easier for you to identify where the issues are. It also helps you course correct faster and get to where you want to be, right? So I would like to introduce to all of you this concept known as the OODA loop. Now, the OODA loop was actually pioneered by the US Air Force as a way, by the US military actually, as a way for people to, as a decision-making framework, right? So, before you do something, you're supposed to observe, then you orientate yourself, then you decide on what needs to be done, and then you act on it. Now, when I work with developers, and given I've worked with a lot of them, I think one of the key challenges that we have these days is when developers face challenges, they will tend to come up with theories around why things are not working the way it's intended to. So they will orientate themselves first, and then they go look for logs to actually justify their orientation, right? So they orientate themselves and then they'll try to observe. And then when what they observe is not what they oriented themselves towards, they will reorient themselves and then they'll look for more logs to back them up, right? I think part of this, we have to take a step back and we should actually start with the observe step first. And then we start, after we have got the information, then we start trying to figure out where the problem is. Then based on that new information, we decide what we need to do, then we act, right? And one of the key principles here that I have for DevOps is, how do we get this loop as short as possible? And a huge part of this is really about, how do we help people observe the right things at the right time so that they can orientate themselves faster, so that they can make the right decisions faster, and so that they can act on it as soon as possible. And, with this requires a lot of observability stuff. You need to have good logging without too much noise, and you need to basically surface up the right information at the right time. And the last point here, extreme ownership. So this was a quote from one of the books I was reading earlier, right, on database reliability engineering. If you're interested in it, please go and download it from O'Reilly. It's actually a free book. I think it's an amazing book, right? So I think one of the things here is, in the whole DevOps movement, a lot of operations folks are being told, oh, you need to learn to code or you need to go home, right? And I do agree with this, and I think the author does as well, right? But I think the other side of that is, software engineers have to learn about operations, right? So that they can actually start writing software that is not fragile and software that's actually performant. So basically, we need both sides of the table coming onto the same, both groups of people coming onto the same table, instead of dev doing their stuff and then ops having to learn how to code. And I think that is really the whole premise of what DevOps is, right? Because you bring dev and ops together. So DevOps topologies, right? So how do you start DevOps in your team, right? So there's this link that I like to share with people often. So this is actually quite a good start for new managers who are trying to figure out how best to structure the DevOps team. It actually has a few anti-patterns of how a DevOps team is structured. So, like this anti-type A, B, C, these are basically when your DevOps teams are bound to fail. There's also the more successful kind of topologies. So this is a good read. I would recommend everyone who's interested in DevOps to actually give this a read later as well. Yes. So I think the main thing here, right, is really start by why are you trying to do DevOps? And I think there's a few key values in DevOps that we are trying to bring out when we talk about it. The first one is the cost of infrequent releases, right? And I think this is something that hits a lot of legacy people hard, but a lot once you understand why you're having more frequent releases, you will start appreciating it more, right? So what's the cost of infrequent release, right? I think it gives the wrong incentives to the other stakeholders within the business. For example, right, the product owners, the design team, and all that, right? So I'll give you an example here, right? Imagine you guys are only allowed access to the supermarket once a year. Now, when you go to the supermarket, what will you buy, right? You'll probably buy everything you can get your hands on, even if you don't need them. Now, if I reduce the timing to every 6 months, right, you'll still buy most of the stuff you don't need as well, because what if you need it one day? Now, if I reduce it down to maybe once a month, right, it's less likely that you'll buy the stuff you don't need, but you'll still buy some of it anyway. Now, if I reduce this timing down to, you can go to the supermarket every single day, then you will stop trying to buy the stuff you don't need. You just buy what you need for the next day. And I think to a certain extent, this is the same for product owners and all, right? So when we have infrequent releases caused by friction in the process, product and businesses end up asking us for everything under the sun, when we're doing roadmap planning or, when we're doing all this other stuff. And then, you start having this friction between the engineering team and the business folks where, they start thinking, oh, the business side will be like, oh, I only have one chance to get all my ass in, so I'm just going to get it all in one shot. And the engineering side is like, oh, you don't give me enough headcount and I can't do any of this work. And then that's probably a common story amongst everyone here. Yeah, when I give this talk live, this is where people start laughing, especially the engineering managers. And I think the other side of the cost of infrequent release is that you don't really have much room to learn, right? Because if you do something not as often, you don't do it. I mean, you only do it once or twice, there's not much learning opportunities. But when you keep doing it over and over again, that is when you start learning new things about the process every single time, right? I mean, we see it like, when kids are learning maths, we see it when, you're learning something for the first time, when you're, for example, learning programming for the first time, right? Learning a new language, right? You have to keep practicing. The same thing goes for deployments. You have to practice. Now, how do you practice? You just deploy more. And as you deploy more, you'll start learning all the edge cases, and then you'll start learning about all the different error scenarios that will take place. And that will actually equip you to handle a lot of these error cases in the longer run. So a lot of effort. So the infrequent releases thing, right, is that you actually have to put a lot of effort into every single release, but you don't actually deliver a lot more value, right? By having a lot more smaller releases, you are reducing your effort over time, and the value is still the same. So why not reduce the effort over time? I think that's the main question I have for a lot of the folks I talk to these days when we talk about why we want to do DevOps. And lastly, and another point here is, really about building up the confidence. So I think one of the things here is, if you only do deployments once a year, right? Every time deployment time comes, you'll be super panicky because you have no idea what will go wrong. But if you actually do deployments every single hour or every single day or even every single week, right, you'll be confident because, if things happen, you know what to do because you've been doing it every single week for the past year. So yeah, this is one of the benefits of, having more frequent releases. And I think there was this paper by ACM that was actually talking about the cost of releasing not often enough, right? Yep, let's go to that now. Yes. So I think one of the cool things about this is, I think back then early on, there were a lot of companies was talking about, doing more frequent releases was actually bad because you have a lot of additional costs and all. And then ACM actually did a paper on it. And the conclusion here was actually quite interesting. Continuous delivery is about reducing the risk and transaction costs of taking changes from version control to production, right? And achieving these goals means you implement a series of patterns that enable developers to create fast feedback loops and work in small batches. And that increases the quality of products and allow people to react more rapidly to incidents, which is basically an agile thing, and react more rapidly to changing requirements, and in turn build more stable and higher quality products and services at low cost. So there are actually a lot of benefits to doing more frequent releases. And of course, developing the deployment muscle, right? Because when you do something more often, it becomes muscle memory. You just do it, and you don't think about it. When something happens, you just know how to fix it, and you kind of have an idea of, oh, this is what I need to do to fix it. Even if you have not met it before, you already know how to get the right information to fix it as well. And I think a main point here for deployment, right, is I see a lot of companies, deployment is a huge event, right? People stay up for 24 hours, they have shifts, and, people come together, and you really have the whole community coming together just to push an app out. And I think one of the key things here, is we should ideally try to make deployments as non-event as possible. So, deployment should be something, I just deploy an app, and you forget about it. And, when you reach that stage, I think that is the highest level of DevOps you can reach. So I think the question here for a lot of people is, how do you know if you are on the right track for DevOps, right? How do you know if you are heading on the right direction? So yeah, I think this is there is another slide I wanted to there's another thing I want to show. So this is the state of DevOps PDF that was published, I think, by Google last year. And I think there is 5 main performance metrics here. So I'm not able to actually screenshot this because of legal reasons, but I'm just showing you the PDF already. So I think there's 5 main metrics here to identify where you are heading from a DevOps perspective, right? And the main thing here is, how long does it take for software to come out from a product owner's mouth to get into the pipeline to be deployed, right? The other metrics you'll be looking at, how often do people deploy? How often does a deployment fail? And how fast does it take for people to recover an application, right? And once you start seeing this number trend in the right direction, that's kind of when you start realizing you are actually on the right track to getting your DevOps journey on the right path. And I would recommend the State of DevOps article link as well. I think it's a very good read. Read through the whole thing. There's a lot of good gems in there as well. And yes, and finally, I think this is the parting message. There is no one right way to get a perfect DevOps system. You have to find your own path. Lots of vendors will tell you there is a right way. I'm here to tell you right now, I've been in 3 different DevOps teams right now. Every team has their own way of getting there. You need to figure out what you're trying to do here. You need to figure out the why. I think the why here is quite clear. It's really just to make a lot of the development chores a non-event. And it's also to reduce friction between a lot of the development chores that we have. And with that, Q&A.
Thanks, Laurence, for the wonderful session. So we'll be moving on to the QA. And here's our first question. Which tools are mainly needed for DevOps?
So, which tools are mainly needed for DevOps? I wouldn't want to go into tools per se. I would say which classification of tools is needed for DevOps, right? So I think the previous speaker brought up a few, like Terraform, and I think there was CI/CD earlier as well. And this basically CI/CD enables you to automate a lot of the chores regularly, right? So CI/CD. Tools like Terraform and all that, they're basically just configuration and documentation as code, right? Because when you look at Terraform, ultimately it's documenting down the state of the infrastructure. So that's what it is. So you have the config as code, and then you probably need a couple of code scanners here and there. So, there's options like SonarQube and all that. And you also need like service registries or even container registries to hold your artifacts for the various deployment artifacts that you have. Something like Sonatype. Is it Sonatype? No, Artifactory. Yes. So there's really a huge variety. You need to figure out what problems you're trying to solve, and then you solve those problems with the right tool. And you have to figure out, make sure that the tool works within your environment as well. Yeah.
Here's one interesting question. Why is your title named as DevOps is Dead?
So I think this started because, I think DevOps started, close to was it 10 years ago or something? But yeah, DevOps started a long time ago, right? And, since then, we started seeing a lot of vendors bring up like, oh, DevOps is Kubernetes now, right? And, some vendors is like, oh, my software is the future of DevOps. And you hear that a lot, right? And you have a lot of enterprises now thinking, oh, to do DevOps, I'm buying a software. Why is my DevOps journey not successful? Right? So I think DevOps as a term is no longer a valid term because DevOps is starting to mean so many things that it means nothing. And, hence DevOps is dead, right? But I think the principles of DevOps is still relevant today, right? A lot of things that we do, is still, if you try to do things by the principles of DevOps, you will get a better development experience down the road. Yeah.
Okay, so I don't see any more questions as of now. If any comes up, we'll take that up on the panel session. But I believe Laurence. Okay, we have one more. How is DevOps different from Agile, SDLC?
So I think DevOps and Agile, I think they're 2 separate concepts. They are meant to support one another. So I think one of the key principles of Agile, right, is really how do you iterate fast? How do you move forward fast? And I think DevOps embodies a lot of these principles. For example, I talked about having more frequent deployments, right? So Agile is about, having more frequent releases, having more frequent kind of reprioritization of your effort. So from a principles perspective, they are really quite alike. I think where it differs is, Agile is more around the process of writing code, whereas DevOps is more around, how do we enable developers to be more productive? How do we remove the chores that developers need to do regularly? Yeah, that's it.
We'll wait 2 more seconds unless another surprise question pops up.
Sure.
I don't think a surprise question is going to pop up for today. So I guess we're done for,
Oh, one more.
There's a surprise.
Wow, so many surprises.
So the question is, what are the different challenges you encountered while adopting DevOps? How did you overcome it?
So I think this question can be a different talk by itself, but let me try to answer without going over time. I think the key challenge when trying to adopt DevOps in your organization, right, is the people challenge, right? You will definitely meet people who will think that you're trying to do something that's impossible, right? Or you'll meet people who's like telling you that automation is bad because automation, they don't understand it, so they just think that it's bad, right? I've had people come to me, so, when I was trying to automate a deployment process, they were like, how do you know your script is good? Because, with human beings, if something goes wrong, you know that the human made an error, you can go after the human for accountability. But, if you use a script, who's accountable for it? So I think there's a lot of legacy thinking. I wouldn't call it legacy thinking there, they just haven't seen this side. So I think it's up to us for trying to adopt DevOps to kind of sell them the idea of what DevOps is supposed to bring and the benefits it comes with. So people challenges. The second challenge that I would say is more on the software side. I think DevOps as a team, one of the challenges, the software that we use have to be, the uptime has to be there, right? So I think we often end up in this kind of conundrum between, do we buy or do we build or do we just leverage on some open source? And leveraging open source might be good and all, but sometimes, especially in large enterprises, you have the issue where open source projects might not have a vendor supporting it. So, when you're working in a regulated environment, using these open source projects might, once it goes down, it might land your team in trouble. So I think there's a balance you have to make based on the business that you are in as well. But for most startups, I think open source is fine, right? So yeah, I think the main thing is people. If everyone's aligned, I think things are great. But yeah, the third challenge I would say is, identifying the right set of metrics for DevOps. Right. One key metric that I used to have for my team was mean time between sleep interruptions, right? So how do we reduce the average time that we need to wake a developer from their sleep? So yeah, that is my answer for that question. I see the next question. What are the core benefits of DevOps? Why is there a need to have a separate team as DevOps? So let me see if I can share can I share my screen again? Hi, organizers.
Sure. We'll just move the presenter rights to you. Okay. Just give us a second.
Yeah. So why is there a need to have a separate team as DevOps? So if you look at this, right, in a lot of these anti-patterns, right? Okay, there's no DevOps here. There's one separate team as DevOps here. That is an anti-pattern, right? There's a small DevOps team here. There's another anti-pattern, right? DevOps team here, also anti-pattern. DevOps team here, also anti-pattern, right? And if you realize a lot of the good patterns here, they don't have a dedicated DevOps team, or they have a DevOps team that is lightweight, right? Or they have a DevOps team that's trying to bridge across two organizations. So I think DevOps team as a team, the capacity needs to be there from the development and the infra side, but the team by itself does not actually necessarily need to exist for you to do DevOps effectively. Yeah, that is my answer. Okay, let's see what's the last question.
Okay, we'll be sharing the screen again.
Yes, is Kubernetes needed for DevOps? I would say no. I think it doesn't really matter. So for example, right, if you have Ansible doing deployments regularly, I think you are doing DevOps, right? You don't actually have to use any software to be doing DevOps. I think that was the gist of my entire talk. As long as you're following the right principles, you are trying to reduce friction in development, you are doing DevOps. Yes, and that is my answer. So let's hope there's no more surprise questions.
We have 2 more questions, but this was dropped on the question panel of GoToWebinar, so I'll be reading it out. First is from Pradeep Singha. What are the critical DevOps tool chain integration points in relation to increased software release velocity?
So to improve the software deployment velocity, right? I think things like CI/CD is definitely needed, right? Because if you are able to automate the whole deployment process, you can do a lot more. And if you can do a lot more, you can do a lot faster, right? And then you definitely need something like Grafana or something to basically measure time so that you kind of understand how to make it faster over time. So I think CI/CD plus a certain degree of monitoring tools.
Okay, so we have a second question from Santosh. The question is, how do you define DevOps maturity levels?
So yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So I think for DevOps maturity model, right, there is this capability maturity model. Not sure if you guys have heard, it's called CMM. Yeah, you can actually go Google for it later, but capability maturity model is actually a very good proxy for the DevOps maturity model. And there are, I think, 4 levels or 5 levels. Yeah, there are 5 levels in it. So the first level is, things are typically undocumented and in a state of dynamic change, right? Tending to be driven in ad hoc and uncontrolled manner. The second level is when things start to be repeatable, possibly with consistent results. The process discipline is not rigorous, but it does exist. The third level is when it's defined, right? It's actually documented and people follow it. The fourth level is when it's managed. So, this process is actually refined and adapted over a period of time, and it enables adaptations to particular projects as well. And the last level is at the optimizing level, where people are constantly trying to make the process more efficient. So I think the CMM model is actually a very good way to measure the DevOps maturity as well. Yeah.
Okay, so that ends all of our questions. We have a hand raised from Karthikeyan S. If you have any questions, please drop it in the chat box. So Laurence, will be moving on to our break for now. If you have any questions, we'll share it with you over your email ID and we can get back to our attendees accordingly.